Integrated information theory is one that gets thrown around a
Mhm.
lot, and I'd love to just broach that for the listeners. Can you give us an overview? Like, what is that theory of consciousness?
Yeah, for sure. So before coming to Florida Atlantic University, I was doing a postdoc for 2 years with Giulio Tononi,
Hmm.
and that was on the philosophical foundations for science of consciousness. And so one of the interesting things, and maybe this is what drew me to IIT and looking into IIT mainly, to a large extent, it's a phenomenology first kind of approach to consciousness, which is distinct maybe from a lot of scientific theories of consciousness, which maybe takes more of a brain first approach.
Yeah.
So what is it structurally about the brain? How do we connect that up to consciousness or cognition, say, in some instances? And what does that tell us? IIT does it a little bit differently, right? It starts by trying to characterize, say, the essential features of our
Mm.
experience and giving axioms. And those axioms are, in some ways, irrefutable characteristics about experience that any theory of consciousness should account for. And then it takes those axioms and it translates them into what they call physical systems postulates. And so those would be the bread and butter, like how does the system or the mechanism, how does that generate experience based off certain principles, right? And the
Yeah.
postulates come with like mathematical formalism, which is really fun to try to get into and learn as a philosopher. Why I depict that daunting task, I will never understand during my master's, but I think I was naive enough to think I could. I learned very quickly I couldn't. But the people who develop IoT, Giulio Tononi, and the people in his lab are more than kind and helpful in communicating with people, and they're particularly interested in the philosophical implications for developing a full consciousness. My work was mainly on what is IoT, or just even the endeavor of trying to come up with science of consciousness. In some ways, what does that tell us about the nature of science more generally? So,
Mm.
does a science of the subjective change what it means to do science in a way, or is it just a separate thing that's a unique scientific discipline in itself? This type of trying to give objective explanations of subjective phenomenon, does that change how we should go about doing it? It's just a question that interested me, and no better way to answer that question than to live as a philosopher with scientists for a couple of years. So that was the
Yeah.
postdoc. But if you want me to comment maybe more generally on the theory, I can do that as well.
Yeah. How is that integrated into your information theoretic theory of consciousness? Like, how much work did it do in yours? Is that just the same thing? Is that synonymous? I don't even know. Like, yeah, help me think about that.
Yeah, yeah. So in my dissertation, I developed metaphysics of consciousness or
Nice.
metaphysics of mind. So the question of what is it about consciousness and its place in reality? What does that tell us about the nature of reality?
Yeah.
And so in answering this question, can we give an information theoretic explanation of consciousness? In some ways, I wanted to, one, ask questions about the nature of information more generally, using the mind and consciousness as a backdrop.
Yeah.
But in some ways, what is the kind of like metaphysics or ontology of information? Now, it sounds strange, right? Because we usually think of information as being processed or the things that computers compute, right? So
Right.
computers send information to each other. When I send you a text message, I'm sending you information, might be relevant, might not be relevant, gift, joke. It still has information, right? And sometimes famously, right, so Searle talks about information. John Searle talks about information being the observer dependent
Yeah.
phenomenon, right? So to have this kind of independent existence, to some extent, I wanted to ask the question, what if information does have an independent existence? Can we conceptualize reality in a way that gets us past sort of the hard problem of consciousness or the mind body problem, gets us past maybe some of these age old questions about how does consciousness come about in physical systems? I developed what I call information theoretic neutral structuralism, which is a neutral monist position.
Oh,
So
sweet.
it takes information as like the neutral entity
Yeah.
and then tries to explain why things like the concepts of the physical and the mental kind of even arise in the first place. In some sense, it was way too big of a project to tackle for my PhD. Luckily, Philip and Tim were very patient with me and everybody else. I somehow muddled together a collection of essays that passed, but it's kind of a project that I'm still working on, and
Yeah.
I don't think it'll end anytime soon. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No, that's
yeah,
so
yeah.
fascinating. There's this philosophy of religion in philosophy of religion circles. They're starting to get into information theory and using it as like a neutral monism. This
Mhm.
one Cambridge element, God and abstract objects. I don't know how to say his name, but Einar Bone, maybe this one right here. He basically goes in for something like that to
Okay.
explain minds, but also to explain God and say like God is like pure information. For my Phil religion folks, there is some overlap here with the neutral monism type stuff, which is awesome.
Interesting. Yeah, cool.
I wonder about I think of Searle and I think of him describing like rings in a tree. So you cut a tree in half, you
Mhm.
see all these rings, and you could say, in a sense, those rings are information about how long or how old the tree is. And he said it's observer relative because the rings could tell about the age of the tree, but the age of the tree can also tell about the rings, and it depends on your own perspective. I've just kind of taken that for granted. Like, how do we get past his observer relativity type theses where we say, no, there isn't. There information has an ontology of its own apart from an objective observer.
Yeah. So I think one of the confusing things too is in some ways we use information as a kind of umbrella term to capture
Oh
all
yeah,
kinds of things, right?
sure.
In some ways, anything that informs us, right, is information,
Yeah,
right? So when you think of the rings of a tree, that's giving us information about its age,
yeah,
right? And in some ways, there's all kinds of information we can get from nature, right? And in some ways, when we ask the question, what is the nature of the existence of information, or say, what is the nature of its being, or does it have a being that's distinct, right?
yeah,
So there's a very common view, right? A very popular view about there is no such thing as kind of information distinct from, say, the physical objects that realize it, right?
yeah.
So you might ultimately, the thing that exists is the physical object. Information is what is given off by it, or something like that, right? So existence is dependent upon the physical.
Right.
I think this is part of what I argue in my dissertation and my current work, right? I actually think this has like problematic assumption about the nature of reality, right? This kind of, and I call it a priority question, right? And in some ways, it's weird to ask this question about could information exist independent of itself, but I think that's only because the priority is assumed, right? The priority is assumed on the side of the physical or the mental, as these age-old debates have always gone, right?
Right.
So it's hard then to imagine distinct from physical or mental reality, distinct from physical or mental objects, right? Imagine information on its own, just
Yeah.
floating out there.
Yeah.
Really, that's where we get everything. The way I try to think about it, and maybe this helps with the kind of thinking about it as an independent thing. If we flip that priority question, right, and we don't ask the question of how do we get information from the physical and mental, but we flip that priority and we ask the question, can we make sense of the universe that the physical and the mental exist without information? And I actually think that is much more revealing when you're asking this question about can we give an information through an explanation of consciousness or reality, et cetera. I think that actually is very revealing, right? Because think about the way that we come to know reality, right? We come to think about reality. We engage with it. We engage with the information that exists, right?
Yeah.
Say senses, or maybe even the way that we cognize it, right? We think about it.
Yeah.
In some ways, we're always manipulating information. There's a kind of famous view from John Archibald Wheeler, this it from bit view, sometimes called digital physics, right? So
Yeah.
common one is that we live in this kind of participatory universe, right? Two particles interact with each other. They pose a yes or no question and they respond no by repelling one another, or yes by attracting.
Yeah.
With kind of view, it's in some ways it's still this idea that the physical is where we get this information. It's these physical interactions. I think it's very interesting when you flip that priority question and you actually go, can we actually make better sense of reality
Mm.
if we accept in some ways that information is maybe more fundamental than physical and mental? Can we solve something like the hard problem? Can we give a more unified picture about the natural sciences? And in some ways, I think that's the way to get to this path of, is there an independent existence? By no means am I claiming that I figured
Yeah.
out the nature of information. In some ways, it's an exploratory project, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, I want to see, can I give the best possible explanation using this? And if I can, I'm increasingly more convinced that it's the better picture of reality and a more unifying picture of reality than maybe we've gotten previously with this kind of stuck dichotomy between physical and the mental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Kind of an answer to your
No,
question.
that's so
Yeah.
good. So I think you already answered my next one, but I want to poke on it some more. The fundamental question or fundamentality question. Like, inputting information as this neutral monism, is that
Mhm.
saying that there's three worlds or something like that, where it's like there's the mental world, there's the physical world, and there's the informational world? Or is it like, ground level, most fundamental is information, and then mind and matter arise out of that? Are they all like equal, or is there a fundamental like a hierarchy?
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to think about it is maybe a way that maybe neutral monisms get parsed out more generally. You sometimes have the difference between a neither view and a both view in neutral
Yeah.
monism.
Yeah.
So a both view would be that ultimately the nature of reality is both physical and mental,
Yeah.
and it has to be, to borrow a phrase from Russell, Bertrand Russell, this kind of common ancestor, which would be information. But ultimately, say the nature of reality is physical and mental. They're just two sides of the same coin. So
Oh yeah.
you
Okay.
might think certain dual aspect monist views are a kind of both view about
Yeah.
neutral monism. Not all, but some. But then you have the neither view. And the neither view would be that the ultimate nature of reality, whatever it might be, say we're assuming it's neutral, developing neutral monism, is neither physical nor mental.
Okay.
I'm inclined to go with that view.
Okay.
That's not to say that I don't think we conceptualize the world in physical or mental concepts. Obviously, we do all the time. I don't think we should reject ever using physical or mental concepts. In some ways, a job, I think, of any kind of, say, neither view about neutral monism, particularly in information theoretic neutral monism, in some ways you need to explain why those concepts even came about in the first place. Why do we conceptualize the world in the physical and mental concepts if its ultimate nature is information or something like that? In some ways, that's one of the trickiest parts of doing a neutral monism, right? Is why did we start parsing the world this way? It's one thing to just say historical inertia because we've used those concepts so much, and those are what the debates are couched in. It's a little bit different though, and it's ontologically and the nature of the being of the thing. Where does these concepts come from? It gets a little tricky. Ultimately, I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of our explanations about the worlds. It's incredibly useful. And one of the things I give in my dissertation and more recent work, in some ways, we have these kinds of pragmatic constraints or explanatory constraints, right? Perfectly fine and justified in those scenarios to use things like physical and mental concepts. They're useful, right? They help us with an agreed upon use of these terms, make sense of it. In some ways, I don't think that should be in any way indicative of what the ultimate nature of reality is, right? If we're
Yeah.
doing that speculative attempt at putting the world to rights or putting reality to rights, right? Telling it what it is. In some ways, I want to keep those concepts as kind of epistemic tools that we use, and then ultimately explain, like metaphysically or ontologically, why information is actually a better kind of fundamental ingredient. So to
Mm,
kind of answer your first question, I don't so much think there's two or three worlds, right? There's
okay.
three worlds of, say, the information theoretic and the physical and the mental, and they will interact in a certain way. Ultimately, I want to be a little deflationary about the physical and the mental and really make that much stronger claim. But the best way to make sense of reality is to accept that information plays that kind of fundamental role. And is actually a much more unifying, say, metaphysical ontological entity than the physical and the mental ever were.